There are moments in entertainment when an audience realizes it is not simply watching a performer. It is watching the beginning of a story that could become much bigger than the person standing in front of the camera. And with Jaafar Jackson, that moment has arrived under perhaps the most impossible circumstances imaginable. He is the nephew of Michael Jackson, the son of Jackson 5 legend Jermaine Jackson, a singer who released music years before Hollywood came calling, and now, after years of preparation, he has stepped onto the biggest stage of his life, portraying one of the most recognizable entertainers who ever lived. But here is the question that has followed him from the very beginning. Was this simply a once-in-a-lifetime casting decision because he happens to be Michael Jackson's nephew? Or are we watching the emergence of an entirely new Jackson talent who could build a career of his own? And there is an even more complicated question hiding underneath that one. Can anyone ever be the next Michael Jackson? The obvious answer is no. Michael Jackson was not merely a singer. He was a cultural phenomenon whose music, dancing, videos, fashion, stagecraft, and visual imagination helped redefine popular entertainment around the world. There is no vacancy for another Michael Jackson. There never will be. But that does not mean Jaafar Jackson cannot become something extraordinary in his own right. In fact, the most interesting part of this story may be that the young man who was suddenly asked to embody the king of pop appears to understand that distinction better than almost anyone watching from the outside. Because what happened behind the scenes was not simply a nephew walking onto a movie set and putting on a famous jacket. It was a years-long transformation. It involved acting lessons, vocal preparation, choreography, archival research, Michael Jackson's personal writings, hours of studying old footage, and training with choreographers who had actually worked with Michael. Jaafar has described the process as a multi-year journey rather than one simple audition. And by the time cameras rolled, he had spent roughly 2 years preparing to face a challenge almost no first-time actor in Hollywood has ever faced. And now the stakes have changed again. The film Michael, directed by Antoine Fuqua and starring Jaafar Jackson in his feature film acting debut, has already crossed the billion-dollar mark worldwide. Box Office Mojo lists worldwide grosses of more than $1.016 billion against a reported production budget of $155 million, with more than $372 million coming from North America and roughly $644 million internationally. That means this is no longer simply a story about whether Jaafar could survive the pressure of playing Michael Jackson. He did. Now Hollywood is asking a completely different question. What happens next? Because Jaafar has already landed his next major role, joining Will Smith and Anna Sophia Robb in the action thriller Supermax. His character details remain under wraps, but production is scheduled to begin in the weeks ahead, making this the first real test of whether Jaafar can step outside the shadow of his famous uncle and prove that the talent audiences saw in Michael belongs to him. And that is where this story gets fascinating, because the real story is not whether Jaafar Jackson can become Michael Jackson. The real story is whether Jaafar Jackson can become Jaafar Jackson. To understand the pressure surrounding Jaafar, you first have to understand the extraordinary size of the shadow he was born into. Michael Jackson did not simply become famous. He became one of the defining figures of 20th century popular culture. His career began as a child with the Jackson 5 and eventually expanded into a solo career that transformed the economics and aesthetics of pop music. His videos became cultural events. His choreography became instantly recognizable. His stage performances became templates. His albums became reference points. And his name became so synonymous with global entertainment that even people who never bought one of his records knew exactly who he was. That is the legacy Jaafar inherited. But Jaafar was not born as a celebrity trying to manufacture a connection to Michael. He was born into the Jackson family itself. Jafar Jackson was born in Los Angeles in 1996, the son of Jermaine Jackson and Alejandra Oaziaza. Jermaine was not simply Michael's brother. He was himself an accomplished singer, songwriter, and member of the Jackson Five, meaning Jafar grew up in a family where professional music was not some distant fantasy, but part of the family's history and identity. And Michael was not an abstract figure to Jafar. He was Uncle Michael. That distinction matters. For millions of Americans, Michael Jackson existed primarily through television performances, music videos, album covers, magazine photographs, and concert footage. For Jafar, Michael was a family member who existed within the same broader family world. Jafar has spoken about spending time with Michael while growing up and visiting places associated with his uncle, including Neverland Ranch. He was only 12 years old when Michael died in June 2009. Imagine what that means psychologically. You are a child. You have a famous uncle. But the famous uncle is not simply famous. He is Michael Jackson. The world watches him. The world imitates him. The world argues about him. The world photographs him. The world remembers every move he made. And then one day, when you are still young yourself, he is gone. Years later, Hollywood comes to you and says, "We want you to play him." That is not a normal acting opportunity. That is an emotional collision between family history, public mythology, and professional expectation. And the first mistake would be to assume that resemblance alone explains why Jafar got the job. It does not. The public certainly noticed the physical resemblance immediately, but the production process, according to interviews with Jafar and the filmmakers, involved extensive preparation and a prolonged audition process. Jafar has described sending a voice recording in which he spoke in Michael's voice and sang, followed by acting coaching, scene work, and increasingly intensive dance preparation. The process reportedly continued for around 2 years before the role was formally secured. That detail is important because it changes the narrative. This was not simply Michael Jackson's nephew gets Michael Jackson role. It was closer to Michael Jackson's nephew spends years trying to prove he can actually play Michael Jackson. And there is a major difference between those two stories. Another misconception surrounding Jafar is that the movie suddenly transformed a complete unknown into a singer. That is not accurate. Jafar had already begun developing his own musical identity years before Michael reached theaters. According to biography and music platform records, he began singing and playing piano at around 12 years old and drew inspiration from artists including Sam Cooke, Marvin Gaye, and Stevie Wonder. In 2019, he released his debut single, Got Me Singing. Apple Music lists the single's release date as June 28, 2019, and credits Jafar with vocals, songwriting, and production. That matters because it gives us a completely different way to understand the voice people are hearing now. Jafar did not wake up one morning because a movie studio needed Michael Jackson and decide to become a singer. He was already working on music. He already had an interest in performing. He already had a musical vocabulary. And yet the Michael project demanded something fundamentally different. It was not enough to sing well. He had to sing like Michael. And that is an enormous distinction. A singer can have excellent pitch, tone, breath control, rhythm, and emotional delivery, and still sound nothing like Michael Jackson. Michael's voice was distinctive not only because of its range, but because of the combination of vocal texture, phrasing, rhythmic placement, breath sounds, consonants, emotional restraint, and explosive release that made his performances instantly identifiable. Then there was the speaking voice, then the physicality, then the choreography, then the psychological challenge of performing as a person whose every movement has already been recorded, analyzed, and imitated by billions of people. Jafar had to learn all of that, and he had to do it while knowing that audiences would be comparing him not to an ordinary actor, but to archival footage of the actual Michael Jackson. That is almost an impossible standard. One of the most revealing aspects of Jafar's preparation is that it went far beyond memorizing choreography. In interviews, Jafar has described studying Michael's archival footage, music, personal writings, poems, mantras, and other material in an attempt to understand his uncle beyond the surface-level imitation. Vogue reported that he spent 2 years researching and training for the role, including studying archival videos and Michael's personal writings. NME reported that Jafar even created a research room filled with material connected to Michael's life and career. He described studying his uncle's writings and constructing a timeline of the world around Michael at different stages of his life. That may sound excessive, but think about the alternative. Suppose an actor has to portray Abraham Lincoln. The actor can study photographs, speeches, and historical accounts. But with Michael Jackson, the audience has hundreds of hours of footage. You can freeze the screen. You can slow it down. You can compare one performance to another. You can listen to a song recorded decades ago and immediately know if the actor's phrasing sounds wrong. The audience becomes an army of experts. Every Michael Jackson fan becomes a potential fact-checker. Every dance enthusiast can recognize a moonwalk that is slightly off. Every musician can hear the difference between an imitation and an authentic performance. And every member of the Jackson family carries memories that no camera can completely capture. Jafar, therefore, had to approach the character from multiple directions. The voice, the movement, the posture, the mannerisms, the emotional rhythm, the performance style, and perhaps most importantly, the internal logic behind the performance. He was not trying to become Michael simply by wearing Michael's clothes. He was trying to understand why Michael moved the way he moved, why he paused, why he looked away, why his voice shifted, why certain gestures became trademarks, why his dancing seemed simultaneously precise and spontaneous. That is where the work became much more serious. Now we get to the part that has generated perhaps the greatest fascination, the singing. Does Jaafar Jackson actually sing in Michael? The answer is yes, but there is an important qualification. The movie uses a mixture of Jaafar's vocals and Michael Jackson's original recordings, depending on the scene and performance. People reported that Jaafar's vocals are used in particular sequences, including solo studio moments, while other portions blend his performance with original Michael recordings. Music supervisor John Warhurst explained that both Jafar and young Michael actor Juliano Valdi recorded their own versions of songs during production. Jafar himself has also described the singing as a blend in parts of the film. So when viewers hear a performance and say, "That sounds exactly like Michael," the responsible question is not automatically, "Is that Jafar or Michael?" Sometimes the answer is both. That is not a trick. It is part of the filmmaking. A biographical musical about a real recording artist has unusual choices to make. Filmmakers can use archival recordings. They can use an actor's performance. They can combine voices. They can use one voice for one sequence and another for a different sequence. The goal is not necessarily to prove that the actor can replace the original artist on a master recording. The goal is to make the audience believe that the person on screen is Michael Jackson. And in certain moments, Jafar's own singing becomes an important part of achieving that illusion. That is why the question, "Is Jafar the next Michael?" is actually too simplistic. A better question is, what happens when a naturally musical performer spends years training specifically to reproduce one of the most distinctive voices in modern music? The result can be startling, but it can also become dangerous if the public stops distinguishing imitation from identity. Jafar is not Michael Jackson. His voice is not Michael's voice. His career is not Michael's career. And that distinction may ultimately be the key to his success. Then there is the dancing. Michael Jackson's choreography is not simply difficult because it is physically demanding. It is difficult because audiences know what the original looked like. The moonwalk is perhaps the most obvious example. Millions of people can perform some version of it, but Michael's moonwalk was not simply a backward glide. It was timing. It was posture. It was illusion. It was musicality. It was the way the movement appeared to emerge from the music itself. Jafar worked with Rich and Tone Talladega, choreographers who had worked with Michael Jackson, and were deeply familiar with his performance style. That is an extraordinary resource. Instead of relying only on archival footage, Jafar had access to people who understood how Michael actually moved in rehearsal. And that difference matters. A video can show you what happened. A person who worked with the performer can sometimes explain how it happened. They can identify details that are almost invisible to a casual viewer. The angle of a shoulder, the placement of a foot, the timing of a head movement, the difference between hitting a beat and anticipating it, the amount of tension in a hand, the relationship between the eyes and the body. Those details are what separate costume from performance. And Jafar's preparation appears to have taken those details seriously. NME reported that his audition and preparation involved extensive acting and dance training, and that the casting process continued over a long period before the filmmakers committed to him. That gives us an important lesson about what audiences are actually responding to. They are not responding only to genetics. They are responding to preparation. Of course, there is another side to this story. Jafar had advantages that most aspiring actors do not have. He was born into one of the most famous musical families in American history. He had access to people and places connected to Michael's life. He had personal memories. He had a surname that Hollywood already knew. And he was playing a role that was intimately connected to his family. Those advantages are real. Pretending otherwise would not be honest. But privilege does not automatically create a convincing performance. Hollywood is filled with children and relatives of famous people who receive opportunities but fail to turn those opportunities into sustained careers. A famous surname can open a door. It cannot walk through the door for you. And Jafar's next project may reveal whether he understands that. Because Michael gave him a role in which every advantage he possessed was directly relevant. His family connection was relevant. His resemblance was relevant. His musical background was relevant. His familiarity with Michael was relevant. His knowledge of the Jackson world was relevant. But what happens when none of that is enough? What happens when he plays a fictional character? What happens when he cannot rely on Michael's choreography? What happens when the audience does not already know what his character is supposed to sound like? That is precisely why Supermax could become so important. In early August 2026, reports confirmed that Jafar had joined the cast of Supermax, an action thriller starring Will Smith and Anna Sophia Robb. The project is directed by David Gordon Green and centers on FBI agents investigating a murder inside a maximum security prison. Jafar's specific role has not been publicly disclosed. This is a fascinating career move. It is almost the opposite of Michael. Michael is based on a real person. Supermax is fictional. Michael is musical. Supermax is an action thriller. Michael requires Jafar to reproduce an existing performance language. Supermax should require him to create something new. That makes the project much more revealing. If Jafar performs well in Supermax, the conversation changes. He would no longer be simply the guy who played Michael Jackson. He could become an actor. That distinction is enormous. And Hollywood loves a breakout story. But Hollywood also loves the next breakout story. So Jafar will face another challenge, avoiding the trap of becoming permanently identified with one role. This happens to actors all the time. An actor gives a performance so memorable that the audience cannot separate the performer from the character. Sometimes that becomes a career-defining blessing. Sometimes it becomes a prison. For Jaafar, the irony would be obvious. He has just portrayed a man who spent his life being trapped inside the world's perception of Michael Jackson. Now, Jaafar himself could become trapped inside the public perception of Michael Jackson. That is the paradox. No serious documentary-style discussion of Michael can ignore the controversies surrounding the film itself. Michael Jackson's legacy remains deeply contested because of allegations of child sexual abuse that followed him for decades. Jackson denied wrongdoing. He was the subject of a civil settlement in the 1990s, and he was later tried on criminal charges in California and acquitted in 2005. These are matters of public record and are essential context when discussing the controversy surrounding the film. The film itself generated additional controversy because of how it handles that portion of Jackson's life. During production, a legal issue connected to a previous settlement reportedly affected the screenplay and led to significant reshoots. Variety reported that the production removed material concerning allegations connected to Jordan Chandler after attorneys identified a clause in a settlement that restricted depiction of him in a future film. Reports estimated the resulting reshoots at roughly $10 million to $15 million. That is not a minor production footnote. It changed the film, and it became central to the debate about whether Michael was intended primarily as a celebration of the singer or as a complete examination of his life. Critics were sharply divided from audiences. The Guardian criticized the movie as overly sanitized and shallow, arguing that it avoided central controversies. RogerEbert.com similarly criticized the film for what it viewed as major omissions. The Wrap also argued that the movie failed to confront the most difficult parts of Jackson's legacy, yet the performance of Jafar Jackson was often treated separately from the film's larger narrative choices. That distinction is important. You can criticize a movie's screenplay while praising an actor's performance. You can question the historical completeness of a biopic while acknowledging that the person portraying the central character worked extraordinarily hard. Those are not contradictory positions. In fact, separating those issues is one of the fairest ways to evaluate Jafar's achievement. The reaction to Michael exposed one of the strangest tensions in modern entertainment. Critics and audiences were not necessarily watching the same movie. The film earned a mixed critical reception, while audience reaction was substantially more positive. One contemporary report cited a Rotten Tomatoes critic score of 38% alongside a 97% audience rating. That gap tells us something. It tells us that Michael Jackson's audience does not necessarily evaluate the film according to the same criteria as traditional film critics. For critics, the question may be, is this a complete, challenging, historically responsible biography? For fans, the question may be, does this make me feel like Michael Jackson is alive again for 2 hours? Those are different questions. And Jafar's performance sits directly in the middle of them. For a critic who believes the film is too sanitized, Jafar may still be impressive. For a fan who came primarily for the performances, Jafar may be the heart of the entire experience. For a casual viewer who barely remembers Michael Jackson's career, Jafar may be the discovery. And for younger viewers who never had the chance to see Michael perform live, the film may function as a gateway into a cultural history they experienced only through clips online. That is part of the reason the movie became such a commercial event. $1 billion global gross changes the conversation. It does not prove that a movie is artistically perfect. It does not settle historical debates. It does not erase criticism. But it does prove something about the commercial power of Michael Jackson's name and the audience's willingness to return to that world. Box Office Mojo lists Michael at more than $1.016 billion worldwide, with a reported $155 million budget. That is a major result for a music biopic, and it creates a powerful economic incentive for studios to look more closely at musical biographies, legacy artists, and family-linked storytelling. Hollywood has already seen major successes with music-centered films, but Michael demonstrates that a legacy artist with global recognition can generate theatrical demand on a truly enormous scale. That creates another possibility. If audiences respond this strongly to the first chapter of Michael's story, what happens when the story continues? The first film does not cover Michael's entire life. That leaves enormous material unexplored. But a continuation would also carry enormous risks. The later years of Michael's life are more complicated, more controversial, and more difficult to dramatize. The further the story moves into his adult years, the more difficult it becomes to create a narrative that satisfies fans while also confronting uncomfortable history. That means a future film would have to answer a question the first movie struggled with. How much truth can a legacy-driven biopic confront before it becomes a different kind of movie? There is another reason Michael became such an enormous event: nostalgia. Nostalgia is one of Hollywood's most powerful economic forces. A familiar song can trigger a memory before the first verse is complete. A familiar costume can transport someone back decades. A familiar dance move can instantly connect generations. The marketing campaign understood this. Variety reported that Lionsgate used highly experiential promotion, including Don't Walk, Moonwalk flash mobs in 20 global cities. Those social media videos generated more than 36 million views, according to the report. The studio also used a Michael Jackson hologram in theaters and malls, and incorporated Jafar into promotional experiences where audiences could learn iconic dance moves. That is not ordinary movie advertising. It is cultural event marketing. The campaign did not simply tell people about the movie. It tried to make people feel as though Michael Jackson had returned to public spaces. And Jafar became the bridge. That is a remarkable position for a first-time actor. He was simultaneously a performer, a character, a member of the Jackson family, and a marketing symbol. He was not merely promoting a movie about Michael Jackson. He was standing in Michael Jackson's visual language. And that creates enormous pressure, because once an actor becomes part of a nostalgia machine this large, every gesture becomes content. Every interview becomes content. Every performance becomes content. Every vocal clip becomes content. Every photograph becomes content. The internet begins measuring authenticity in seconds. The internet has also changed the way celebrity legacies are evaluated. In the past, audiences waited for television interviews, magazines, or newspapers to interpret a new performer. Now, the audience interprets the performer instantly. Someone uploads a clip. Someone slows it down. Someone isolates the vocals. Someone compares the movement frame by frame. Someone posts a reaction. Someone says, "This is the next Michael." Someone else responds, "Nobody will ever be Michael." Someone else says, "Stop comparing him and let him be himself." And suddenly a career discussion becomes a cultural argument. That is exactly what has happened around Jafar. The debate is bigger than whether he can sing. It is about inheritance. It is about legacy. It is about whether talent can be passed through a family. It is about whether resemblance is destiny. It is about whether the Jackson name helps or hurts him. It is about whether audiences are ready for another member of the family to become a major entertainer. And perhaps most importantly, it is about what younger generations are allowed to inherit from cultural history. For some viewers, Michael Jackson is the soundtrack of childhood. For others, he is a complicated historical figure whose music remains extraordinary despite unresolved questions about his legacy. For younger audiences, he may be a name encountered through TikTok clips, YouTube performances, documentaries, and streaming playlists. Jaafar enters all of those conversations at once. Let's stop here and confront the headline. Is Jaafar Jackson the next Michael Jackson? It is a great YouTube question. It is also the wrong question, because Michael Jackson's career cannot be replicated. The music industry that created Michael Jackson no longer exists in the same form. There is no MTV environment exactly like the one that helped turn music videos into global events. There is no identical record industry system. There is no identical cultural moment. There is no identical relationship between television, radio, physical albums, concert tours, and celebrity journalism. And there is no Michael Jackson himself. So if Jaafar tries to become the next Michael Jackson, he will be chasing something impossible. But if he uses what he inherited, the musical education, the family history, the discipline, the knowledge of performance, and turns those things into his own identity, then something genuinely interesting could happen. He could become the first Jafar Jackson. That sounds less dramatic, but it is actually much more ambitious, because imitation can only take you so far. Originality is where careers survive. There is an emotional layer to this story that the Hollywood business analysis can easily miss. Jaafar is not playing a historical stranger. He is portraying his uncle. That means some of the most important moments in the film are inevitably connected to memories that belong to his family. He has described the experience as an honor and has spoken about wanting to tell Michael's story with pride and gratitude. Vogue reported that he considered the role an honor of a lifetime and spent extensive time researching Michael from the beginning of his career through adulthood. For the audience, a scene may be entertainment. For Jaafar, it can be a recreation of family history. Imagine recreating the person you remember from childhood. Imagine hearing the voice again. Imagine copying the movements. Imagine putting on the clothes. Imagine standing in front of cameras while hundreds of crew members watch you become someone you actually knew. That is emotionally different from playing a fictional character. There is no completely safe distance, and that may be one reason the preparation was so intense. The more personally connected the role is, the more dangerous it can be to approach it casually. One of the most important things audiences should remember is that Jaafar Jackson is not responsible for being born into the Jackson family. He did not choose the surname. He did not create Michael Jackson's legacy. He did not create the expectations surrounding him. But he does have a choice about what he does with those circumstances. That is what makes the next stage of his career so compelling. If Jaafar's only ambition were to recreate Michael forever, he would be trapped. But if his ambition is to learn from Michael, honor his family, and then build something new, he has a much wider future. And his own musical history gives us evidence that this possibility already existed before Hollywood. His 2019 single, Got Me Singing, established him as a recording artist independently of the biopic. Apple Music credits him as vocalist, songwriter, and producer on the track. That means audiences now have two possible Jaafars to discover. There is the Jaafar who portrays Michael Jackson, and there is the Jaafar who wants to make his own music. The second one may ultimately be more important. The hardest performance Jaafar has to give may not be another Michael Jackson performance. It may be the performance in which he does not look like Michael Jackson at all. That is where Supermax enters the story. If he plays a character in an action thriller, and audiences forget about the moonwalk, forget about the Jackson surname, and simply watch the character, that will tell us something powerful. It will tell us that the performance in Michael was not a one-off illusion. It will show that he can build a character without having an archival reference point. That is an entirely different skill. And if he struggles, that will not mean Michael was a failure. It will simply mean that becoming a good actor takes more than one performance. Jaafar has never claimed otherwise. In fact, His preparation suggests he understands how much work acting requires. His first major acting role demanded years of training. Now he has to prove he can do it again without Michael Jackson's shadow providing the blueprint. At first glance, this may seem like another celebrity story, another famous family, another movie, another viral singing clip. But there is something larger happening here. America has always been fascinated by artistic inheritance. We love stories about sons and daughters following parents into sports, music, acting, and business. But we are equally fascinated by the opposite question. Can the child escape the parent's shadow? The Jackson family is perhaps the most extreme example imaginable. Michael followed the Jackson Five, and then became larger than the group itself. Janet built an enormous career of her own. Jermaine became an established artist. And now another generation is entering the spotlight. Jafar has inherited an extraordinary cultural history, but inheritance is not the same thing as destiny. A family name can give you attention. It cannot guarantee relevance. The audience eventually decides. It is tempting to say that because Michael made more than $1 billion, Jafar has already become a superstar. That would be premature. The film's success belongs to many people. The director, producers, cast, writers, musicians, marketing teams, distributors, Michael Jackson's enormous global catalog, and the audience itself. $1 billion movie does not mean one actor personally generated $1 billion, but it does create visibility, and visibility is one of the most valuable currencies in Hollywood. Jafar now has something most new actors spend years trying to obtain. A global audience has seen him. More importantly, a global audience has an emotional association with him. They watched him embody one of the most famous performers in history. That is a huge platform. The challenge is converting attention into credibility. Fame can happen overnight. A career usually does not. Jafar's Michael breakthrough is fame. His next several projects will determine whether it becomes a career. That is why Supermax matters. That is why his future music matters. That is why his interviews matter. And that is why the next year or two could be more important than the opening weekend of Michael.